So let me make sure I'm not on any high horses right now, because I'll come right off that thing to get to this point. You ever seen an agent who only recommends one type of Medicare plan, right? And it's not a random thing because we run into it out in the wild several times. And I want to contest that it doesn't automatically mean something bad. It just means that there's a structural reason behind their thinking or their logic. I think if we can understand the reasoning behind that, the whole Medicare market may start to make a lot more sense overall. This is Ansel with probably about a 6-minute Medicare minute. Let's dive right into it. All right, first of all, let's start with a reality check. Medicare isn't one simple, easy decision. Boom, check, done. We understand that, so I can continue this video now. Essentially, there's two pathways or two roads when you're coming into the Medicare question, right? So you've got your options. You either go with original Medicare plus a Part D, as long as you don't want a penalty or you don't have other credible coverage, and then ideally a Medigap, right? Or you go with Part C, which is a Medicare Advantage plan. Now, these are not minor variations. They are not completely separate from the other, but there's many things that separate the ideas between traditional Medicare and Medigap and an MA plan. They operate under completely different reimbursement structures. They have much different underwriting realities. In fact, MA doesn't have underwriting. Traditional Medicare doesn't either, but a Medigap does. And they both have their own long-term risk profiles that you have to understand. So if you have an agent who specializes in one and not the other, it's usually tied to how each system behaves operationally. So if we start with traditional Medicare and a Medigap, outside of your initial enrollment period, or if you're in a state that has some type of guaranteed issue situation, Medigap usually involves medical underwriting. Not always, but typically, right? So that means an agent has to ask you health questions, that you have an approval risk, and you have possible declines if you have underlying health issues. So for some agents, that might create uncertainty, and they might spend an hour, 2 hours with a client, and the carrier still say no to the application they put through. Now, Medicare Advantage, on the other hand, now used to ask you if you were skilled nursing care, but now it has no medical underwriting. So that enrollment friction right off the bat is significantly lower on an MA. You know, as long as you're in a time period where you can write an app, that approval is certain to go through, and usually there's a faster process to the whole situation. So for high volume agents and call centers, the predictability of MA probably makes sense there. And that shapes a lot of that market. Logistically, right? Economically, which is just reality, Medicare Advantage typically, not always, typically pays a larger upfront new to Medicare commission with renewal structures that are tied to the member's retention rate. Now, Medigap, on the other hand, often pays lower upfront, but has a decent renewal stream depending on the carrier for how long that is, and depending on the state for how long that is, as well as bonuses. Now, some agents prefer that immediate production economic, right? Others prefer the long-term residual model that a Medigap brings. Some FMOs train heavily toward one structure over the other, again, because the economic viability that it's able to bring to them. But that absolutely influences what their agents will be comfortable recommending. If all you talk about is MA, guess what your agents are going to sell? And if all you talk about is Medigap, guess what they're going to sell? Another piece that consumers might not be privy to is that MA involves navigating networks, checking formularies, understanding how prior authorization works, and then how to appeal it if you're denied, and then monitoring your ANOC letter for annual plan changes, right? Annual plan design. So there's constant comparison year to year amongst different plans. Where on the Medigap side, once you're placed properly, it's operationally the same thing every year. You're just checking for a new drug plan. So there's much fewer annual changes and significantly more stability in the coverage structure. So some agents prefer the ongoing engagement model that an MA brings to the table. Others prefer the set it and leave it model. So that shapes the specialization that an agent takes as well. If you have an agent who's only selling one type of Medicare, I don't think it's fair to assume that they're wrong, because it's what's right for them. But I do think we need to understand that every advisor is developing their expertise where their workflow, their training, and their experience live. The important thing behind that then isn't does this advisor only recommend MA or does this advisor only recommend Medigap? I would think the more important question to ask is, can they clearly explain both systems, including the downsides and the upsides, before they actually recommend one to a member? That's the real test. It doesn't matter where they lie, whether they're more MA-centric or Medigap-centric. You know, Medicare is not about finding an agent or a correct broker who can sell one company's policy. It's about finding an agent who understands the architecture of Medicare well enough so that they can match the structure of Medicare and the risk structure to you as the client. That then is the difference between picking someone who can just enroll you anywhere and advising you on your future with Medicare. Because once again, I've said this several times, when we're dealing with Medicare, we're not talking about what's going to happen to you most likely over the next 2-3 years. A good agent will project for you the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. Because most people, average age of death is 81 female, 79 male. We'll cut it in the middle at 80. You know, most people are looking for at least the next 15 years of their life when they sign up, especially at 65.